Good evening, everybody. I'm Bob Weathers here at the Vitality Project and with my dear friend and our collaborator for a long time, Angela MacLeod.
Yeah. Hi, Bob. Good to be
Hi,
here.
nice to see you. Thank you. I'm glad you're here, Angela. It's great. Our topic is a favorite one of Angela's and mine. It's something that we've talked about a lot over the years now. And the topic is how do we locate resilience in our lives? And I've introduced this week in our posts, and I know you've seen them, Angela. This idea, and it comes out of a particular approach to building resilience. It's really been developed in great measure by our mutual acquaintance and friend Guy du Plessis. Guy is in
Okay.
South Africa, and he's written co-written a book called The Mind Body Workbook for
Oh, yeah.
Addiction Recovery and Relapse Prevention. And Guy and I are embarking right now on a revised edition of this book, and so this material is up and fresh right now. For sure. And one of the things that comes out of this theory, it's less of a vocabulary that I've used in the past, and frankly, it may not be a vocabulary I use in the future, but it's not a bad way to kind of get into the conversation. Is that a Guy and Stanley Block, who is the primary author of this book, talk about the 𝗟 system, which is kind of what do we identify with, and their shorthand for that is 𝗟 system. And I prefer using a different terminology, and I think you may prefer using even a different terminology. But I've come over the course of the last weeks as I've been working on this project to think of the resting brain. You could say resting brain and body, but what is it that in the face of stress that we can do to cultivate a connection to even staying in a restful or resting brain type of space versus what I'm calling the red alert brain, which
Okay.
in 𝗟 system language, which is the theory out of which Guy and Stan have developed their model, when the 𝗟 system is on, it means the individual is in an overstimulated, overactivated place. It's highly correlated with distress. It's also correlated with increased cravings when it comes to addiction, and also correlated with increased relapse risk. So all of that goes with the 𝗟 system on. If you can learn how to shut off the 𝗟 system, so to speak, I prefer to think of it in terms of if you can learn how to turn on the resting brain, but it's just a different language for it, that it tends to be associated with resilience rather than distress. Tends to be associated with fewer cravings, for sure, and far less relapse risk, and so far less vulnerability to addictive behaviors. And so I'm very interested in this, and what comes with this are very, very specific skills that they've developed, some of which you and I share in common in terms of, for example, mindfulness and so on. And some of them are very specific. I think of them as being more cognitive behavioral strategies, and I'm going to be fleshing those out over the next several weeks of posts and so on, because I want to bring these tools, these skills to others, and then you bring a whole host of skills to being able to help us to recenter and to find a more resilient stance in the middle of our lives as they are. And I also know and very much respect that you have a different vocabulary that's based in the work of Stephen Porges and others around nervous system regulation. And it's not that I don't believe that we're going to write the book to include that model, because we have so many other things we're doing. But I want to invite you, Angela, to comment insofar as you wish to about how you think about that in terms of what I'm calling resting brain and red alert brain, how you think about that in terms of the nervous system, how that relates to addiction or maybe resilience in the face of stress and relapse prevention, let's say, but also any thoughts that you have about skillful means for cultivating this other mode. Another language that we use for it is the default mode network,
Uh-huh.
which we default towards distress, actually, towards kind of hypervigilance and distress. How can we create something in its place that represents more the executive mode network? There are multiple vocabularies, but I'm interested particularly in your vocabularies.
Okay. Yeah, wonderful. I really love hearing about different models with different terminology. I feel like we can use as many models as, I mean, why not have as many models that are different, that can serve different people's needs or speak to people? Like one model that I'm really interested in may not speak to somebody else, whereas the I system or the default mode network terminology or whatever can speak to a different person or set of people.
Yeah.
So I just feel like the more the better, really. And as I was reading the posts and as I'm listening to you, I just feel a grin inside, like, yay, there's an essence in all of this that's very similar. It's just different ways of verbalizing it or articulating it.
Yeah.
So, and it is actually something, this topic is probably one of my favorite topics, partly because I will speak more from my own experience as to why I've never really seen myself as being that interested in science. I think I have a science side of me that likes to understand through that modality on a sort of basic level, have the proof, have the evidence and verified through studies that are objective. However, how I came into this whole thing was in my own recovery, getting rid of the actual addiction, stopping the addiction, stopping the primary addiction, because I still have things that I have addictive tendencies with. But that seemed to reveal or uncover deep distress, deep anxiety and depression, even to the point of almost suicidal. And it took a lot of different approaches, one-on-one therapy, with the right therapist that really worked for me. Many modalities, looking at it nutritionally, holistically, and finding I was just listening to your Facebook Live with Michael Morar, and finding that sense of purpose. But even in early recovery, when I wasn't really ready to full steam ahead on my new career, however, just having a sense of purpose was really enlivening. So all of that, but that leads into, I did find something that connected with my sense of purpose, connected me with my love of movement and dance, and that was Qigong. And as I practiced and delved into it on a day-to-day basis, every day, day after day, I started to have more of a sense of, oh, I'm okay. I feel okay. I don't feel ecstatic, but I don't feel this horrible, deep, stuck in depression. Or if I feel energized, I usually felt it as anxious and I couldn't focus and that kind of thing. These are all subjective. These are all like, and how I experienced being at my nervous system being way out of balance, dysregulated, or in the term of the I system, on red alert or in a more collapse mode. If I understood what you were saying, that's a new term for me today, actually, the I system. So I hope I got that right. And then the resting brain and body, as you were calling that, or the resilient brain, would be in the nervous system mode that is very natural, and we're all equipped. I would say probably everybody. Our nervous system is equipped with this mode called the parasympathetic nervous system, that has those qualities of feeling at rest, feeling calm and present, being interested in relating to other people, having access to creativity. All these are different ways that I would describe that kind of a mode. So for me, one of the features of the being dysregulated, that's a nervous system term, is that we're in a part of the nervous system, a branch of our natural nervous system that is there for a reason. It's a survival mode. But the key thing in my mind is being stuck there, having that dial turned up and on, and you can't seem to turn it down. And so for me, the goal isn't necessarily to only be in that relaxed, calm baseline. That's what I call it, a centered, present baseline. But it's when something stimulates me or activates me into that stress mode that I have resources, as you were saying. I have resources, I have practices, I have skills, ways of returning to that calm baseline. So that's kind of my overview there. There's sort of another side of that, which is the collapse mode, which is another part of the nervous system. We have these different branches or circuits of our nervous system. And again, that has its own value. In fact, deep meditation is part of this third branch of the nervous system, that when it's constant and the dial is turned way up on that, then we experience shame, dissociation. There's many ways that we can experience being in that mode. For example, hopelessness, depression, lack of motivation. But interestingly, that circuitry is also part of where we are when we're experiencing deep places of meditation, and also when we're going into a deep sleep. So, not to make it all sound very complicated, but it actually is very complex. You know, as you can imagine, our interiors are very complex. But how's that for a little start?
Well, you've really piqued my interest. I appreciate your overview, first of all, because you're so skillful at distilling a lot of complex information into I think very simple, easy to understand expressions. I appreciate that a lot, Angela. You've really piqued my interest by this last point, and I'd love to ask you more about it. The relationship of what you refer to as the collapse mode, and it has its more adverse or unpleasant aspects, such as depression or a subjective sense of hopelessness. And I'm also curious of what differentiates that in the body and in the psyche from, like you were saying, deep meditation. I'm very curious because it sounds like they're going through a similar channel, but have very different subjective reference points. I'd be very curious to hear more. It's new to me, and I'm interested.
Yeah, it's new to me too. And so some of it I'm going to wing it a little bit, my best understanding or my best interpretation. And one is that we all carry a certain amount of trauma or woundedness. And so I think that if that hasn't been healed, or to some degree, I mean, not that we can heal everything perfectly, but if we're carrying a lot that hasn't been healed, when we go into that deep place in meditation, it may also include touching into some of the deeper wounds. So there's a certain amount of work or processing that might need to happen. The other part that is on the more neurological, sort of technical level, which I've just recently been learning about from Deb Dana, who works with Stephen Porges, is that there's actually an interrelationship between the ventral vagal branch of the parasympathetic nervous system and the dorsal vagal branch. Okay, so ventral vagal branch, when that's turned on, and mostly what we're operating in that circuit, that is sort of another way of saying we're in that the resting brain, social engagement mode. But when that other branch is more dialed up, the dorsal vagal branch, they're part of the same system but two different branches, then and with a lot of disturbance with the deep within us, so what I was trying to get to is that there's a relationship between those two branches. The ventral vagal branch actually can mediate and moderate between the dorsal vagal branch and the sympathetic nervous system. So really what we want is the ventral vagal branch to be the master in our nervous system. It's sort of like having our prefrontal cortex in the driver's seat, so to speak. So that's sort of a quick way of explaining it the best that I understand it right now. Did that make sense?
It does. I'm always interested in these things. I have to tell you, I'm so concrete. Is that when we talk about the dorsal vagal, I have to literally think of a dorsal fin on a
That's
on a.
good. That's right. It is. It's in the back, and the ventral vagal is in the front. So
So are there two different nerves? Are they two different nerves? Are they
think of
cranial nerves
like,
or?
think of it like one nerve coming down from out of the neck, out of the base of the stem of the brain,
Uh-huh.
and then it branches.
Ah, thank you.
Yeah,
All right. All
that's
right.
why it's called a branch. The
Yeah.
dorsal vagal branch, the
Okay.
ventral vagal branch.
Okay. Okay. So one comes down our back, one comes down our front, and that the goal is to get the one that comes down our front, the ventral, to help to modulate, to help to calm down the dorsal vagal. And I'm assuming that the dorsal vagal must be tied directly or indirectly into the sympathetic nervous system. Is that accurate?
They have a relationship. I don't understand physiologically in our body exactly how they are related. And so they're in communication. I like to think of it as these branches. They're not just separate, completely separate. When we talk about it, we have to be able to explain the different parts separately, but then really they're in this dynamic, constantly interactive relationship.
You know, it reminds me of a couple of things that have come up over the years for me working in addiction education and recovery coaching. I've had individuals who are in recovery ask me these questions. I've also had family members ask me, they'll say, Dr. Bob, is there an addiction gene? And I remember early on reading, and there were some very controversial studies that suggested they had isolated the addiction gene. That has long since been dispelled because it's much more complicated, not only because there's a whole interaction between genetics involving a number of DNA strands, and with environment. So that's the whole field of epigenetics. You can't say there's a gene that's going to predict that you be addicted. You can't even say there's a set of genes because it's so connected to one's environment. So that's a complicated thing, and it doesn't satisfy people because it's not a simple answer. And there's another one that comes up is that, in fact, Guy and Stan write about this in their book, Mind Body Bridging. I got that book. It's up there, and I don't want to get up for fear of knocking over everything. the mind body workbook for addiction. I wrote the foreword to that book some years ago, and I loved it. And one of the things that I think it was Dr. Block that introduced me to this idea of the default mode network. No, that's not true. You know, before that, in my supervision with Bonnie, she had introduced me to this back in the early 2010s, whatever you call that.
Okay.
Probably around 2008 or 2009. Bonnie had said they'd just come out with research. Bonnie Badenoch is another kind of leader in this field. And she shared with me that they'd just come out with research. And it was really at that time with this idea of a default mode network that we default to this. And it's kind of counterintuitive that we would default to something that probably is connected to I would guess, the dorsal vagal nerve and the sympathetic nervous system. But that we default towards vigilance, which is associated with a certain kind of hyper activity of the sympathetic nervous system. And it's fine when it's due to circumstances, but if we stay chronically in that place, it eats us up alive. And so it's very related to addiction, that's for sure. And so people will say, well, where's the default mode network located? You know? Or it's opposite. Where's the executive mode network located? And you can roughly say, but it's rough, you can roughly say that the default mode network finds a lot of its traction in the midbrain, you know, the survival center of the brain that's connected to fight or flight or freeze, and that the executive mode network is roughly finds its kind of center of gravity in the forebrain or the frontal cortex. But to say either one of those and get too concrete about it is to be really problematic. And there's not a neuroscientist out there that would say, yeah, we've located we've located, here's the executive mode network and here's the default mode network. It's not like that. And I don't think it's like that probably in many domains. And I think all of us by nature want to find simple answers. I don't mind using things like the resting brain and the red alert brain. Those are totally my terms. I've invented them just because I think that they communicate, but it's not like that you can go someplace and find it. But it gives us a way to share language, and also I think share strategies about how we might attain this. How might I? In fact, I want to ask you. We have a few minutes left. I want to ask you what means might we have to cultivate what you were referring to as the ventral vagal kind of
circuit,
as opposed and as a way to kind of manage the dorsal vagal circuit and its impulses and so on. I think what's implied in this, whether we're talking about resting brain and ventral vagal, or red alert brain and dorsal vagal, whatever languages we use, the I-system language certainly pertains, default mode network, executive mode network. The bottom line is, what can I do to cultivate the one modality in favor of sustained sobriety and successful recovery, as opposed to constantly being at risk of what I'm calling in today's post and yesterday's post, the time relapse. The relapse time bomb.
The relapse time bomb,
The idea that there's this time bomb ticking and it's just a matter of time before you relapse. That term, by the way, is directly from Stan and Guy's book. I want to give them full credit for that. But this idea of what can we do to instill more of a sense of being able to trust ourselves. And I'm curious, in the last 5 minutes or so, Angela, any suggestions that you might make towards our being able to cultivate more peace of mind and body?
Yeah, in 5 minutes, okay. First is awareness. That to me, that is always first, to be aware of what we're feeling inside, how we're experiencing any particular moment of our lives. So becoming aware when we're in the red flag mode of the brain. Not just the brain, but we can feel it in our bodies. Our heart pounds, we're nervous, we can't think clearly. Like I was saying earlier, I like to use those sort of actual layperson terms for what people actually experience when they say they're anxious, they can't focus, they feel irritable all the time. Or on the other hand, kind of on the other side of the spectrum, feeling lack of motivation, low energy, flat, no zest for life, or hopeless. Those are all signs of how our nervous system, what mode we're functioning in predominantly. So first, being aware of that. The next is, there are many, many ways that are very simple, and it's so individual, it's hard to give you any list. Although that is actually what I'm doing. I'm exploring all these different methods or simple techniques. Breathing is one of the easiest, most direct ways. So long, slow exhalation. Breathe in, hold for a moment, breathe out for around 6 seconds. So long exhalation, a brief, big inhalation, a long, slow exhalation. Repeating that a number of times, maybe 6 times, will give you a little taste, probably, maybe 8 times. I'm not sure what. It's individual. That's just one thing. And the reason I say that is that our breathing happens naturally, automatically, right? Most of the time we don't have to think about it. The part of our nervous system, our nervous system is actually engaged with keeping our breath going and our heart beating. That's the automatic nervous system. We can directly influence our nervous system by changing our breath. So if you notice that you're breathing shallow, and your heart is pounding, if you do some of those long, slow breathing, then that will help to shift that. That's one of the quickest, most easy ways to enter that. But there are so many. Coming together with somebody that you love and trust and you feel comfortable with, we call it the co-regulating. Like if somebody is feeling really calm and loving toward you and you get together with them, that will help your nervous system to come into that. So that's on a relational mode. There's play mode. If you get into, I just heard about laughter yoga. And I'm going to explore that a little bit because I don't laugh very much. So laughter is physiological. It's a physiological experience, but it connects with your state of mind, you know, to connect in with laughter. So it's not just a physiological entry point. It can be through many different facets of our being. And knowing what, that's what I mean, get back to awareness, knowing what works for you. If going on a long, brisk walk is helpful, that can help you move that energy and shift into that, what did you call it? Resting brain, resting body mode. So, well, I could go on and on.
I want you to know we will.
A big list.
Yeah, we will. We'll be fleshing this out over time. I think what you've provided is suggestive, and people can immediately apply the breathing exercise or going for a walk, and ideally being able to laugh and connect with friends. And we'll be fleshing this out over time. I know that I fully intend over the next weeks here at your Vitality Project to give very specific instructions for different practices. And I'm going to invite you and I, when we meet here on Friday nights, to bring a practice. And I would fully invite our being able to spend our 20 or 30 minutes together in an exercise, and the people could practice with us and then take it with them during the week. And so I really want to look at this as an opportunity for us to really provide kind of practical tools. I think we're both invested in that. I also want to invite anybody who's watching us to come join Angela and me during the week. We have two Vitality Project groups that meet each week. They meet at 5:30 Pacific time. They're 5 o'clock Pacific time on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They're an hour in length, and we have people from all over the country, actually all over the world, that come to these groups. And part of what we share in the groups is what you're sharing tonight, Angela, is people will share their resources. Sometimes it's a book, sometimes it's a practice, sometimes it's an insight or a challenge. But I love that regular group meeting. And so I want to invite, and Angela and I are both part of that. And so I want to invite anybody who's watching tonight that might be interested to come check that out as well, because that's another really rich resource. Angela and I'll be back here. We're holding this space every Friday, and more will be revealed, that's for sure. But this is a good start, and I'm really appreciating tonight, really all that you're bringing. I love learning new things as I listen to you, and I like the fact that our languages are complementary. That there's a way that you and I are I think really committed similarly, and at the same time, you're a dancer by background, and I happen to be a drummer by background, and we can go down the list, but we bring different resources. So I really invite anybody to come back and join us here too. There's a banner at the bottom here. Let me just double check here. There's a banner. Somebody wrote, Spencer wrote, laughter yoga. Yep, laughter yoga, Spencer. If you haven't joined your Vitality Project, please do. There's a link down below here. It's vitalityproject.life. It gives you the instructions there. And for you to know, we have a workshop coming up. It'll be early October. We have a workshop. I'm working with great dedication right now into material that's really moving into a phase of looking at what I'm thinking of as advanced recovery. And I don't mean that as some rarefied thing. I feel like that the first order of business for the clients I work with, for example, in treatment centers, is to get sober. And that's no small feat, to get our bodies just basically regulated enough to be able to stop for what for many people has been severe addiction. But that's a start. And so that start I think of as basic recovery or beginning recovery. I think of it as phase one. And then advanced recovery would be phase two. And that's really what you and I are talking about tonight, is what are the tools that I can learn? It's one thing to get sober. And that's a huge, huge achievement in my view. It's a whole nother thing to be able to sustain that sobriety. And that's what I'm really committed to. And you are, Angela. It's right in the heart of our work. And so I feel like this third workshop coming up will be we've had 2 workshops previously. In July, we had a workshop that featured talking about the biology of addiction rooted in scientific research. And it's really important to me that not only individuals in recovery, but their loved ones understand that. Most lay people are quite ignorant, and actually quite a few professionals are ignorant of the biology of addiction. The second workshop, which was in August, we just did this a few weeks ago, it really looked at the psychology of addiction and recovery, specifically looking at the impact of shame on us, not only in active addiction, but in early recovery, and how shame is so connected to stress, and how stress is the #1 trigger for relapse. And so I wanted to look at the psychology of addiction and recovery in depth, and we did that in the second workshop. The third workshop, this one in October, is going to be incorporating things that you and I are talking about right now, Angela, incorporating practical tools that we'll be introducing and expanding. I plan to have a workshop a month through the fall that will be introducing new tools that I really think of as more advanced tools that will help people to maintain what it is they've gotten in terms of initial sobriety. And the goal, as you and I have talked about, is to laugh, to enjoy, to really thrive. And so if the initial goal of recovery is to get sober, then I think the more advanced goal would be to heal ourselves and get our lives back on board. Sometimes I think it's like getting our birthright back on board, so that we can truly contribute in the ways that we were meant to in our lives, and experience fulfillment. So that's where we're headed, everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm on board.
I know you are. I appreciate very much your incredible support, and also your deepening expertise in these areas that you bring. I really value what you bring to the table, and I'm looking towards our including various curriculum contributions in your Vitality Project. I'm really building out this curriculum of practical applications. And Angela, I really see your contributions as not only being a part of that, but also standing independently, both under the umbrella of your Vitality Project for people that have ears to hear and eyes to see, but also I want to support you in your career as it continues to evolve. You made mention of it earlier, and it's wonderful that both of us get to be engaged in meaningful contributions that provide a real sense of purpose. And I know it does for you, and you know it does for me. So here we go. I'm going to sign off for right now. I really appreciate your engagement. I thank you for your contributions. Appreciate everybody's joining us. Wish you a wonderful weekend. Okay, stay safe. Be well, everybody. Thank you, Angela. Good night to you. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.